Imagine night on the island city of Tenochtitlan, a cool breath from the lake, the resine, thick smoke of copal lifting in gauzy veils, and drums that do not merely sound but insist hollow, steady, like a second pulse laid over your own. Torchlight breaks in gold shards along serpent balustrades and temple stairs. On rooftops and in courtyards, people raise censers toward the four directions. A small domestic act the Mexica call ordinary piety, the air itself turned into an offering. In the great precinct, priests feed incense again and again when the sun appears, at noon, at sunset, at midnight, before the grey seam of dawn, so that the gods are never without scent, never without breath. The city smells of pine and honeyed sap and something sharper, like hot stone after rain. It is not quiet. It is expectant. We tell ourselves tidy stories about the Aztec Empire warfare, tribute, skull racks, and miss the stranger country at its heart. A moral world where the body is an altar, appetite is dangerous and holy, and blood is currency in a cosmic economy that never closes. The Nahua did not speak of sin the way Europeans would later insist. They spoke of crookedness, of sliding off the middle path, of hearts that need straightening. Their word for the right is a mouthful that lands like a command. Niol melahualisli, the setting straight of one's heart. Scholars have argued over how closely this resembled Christian confession, but the ritual appears again and again in the 16th century accounts. A penitent goes to a wise person, tells what has gone astray, and is given a road back made of heat, abstinence, offerings, and pain. At the edge of the sacred precinct stands a small structure, dark and humming like a beehive. The Temescal, the sweat house. Tonight its door is low, its stones red with heat, its breath wet and herbal. A young man crawls inside on hands and knees as if returning to a womb. He has been told to keep to water and maize gruel, to abstain from pulque and sex, to speak little, to let heat and steam loosen what clings. The Temescal is therapy, midwife, and courtroom at once. As steam drips from his hair, he thinks of what he will say when he kneels before the goddess who eats filth. Tlazolteotl waits at the point where desire rots into shame and then, impossibly, into cleanness again. In the painted books she can be a mother, a temptress, a destroyer, a forgiving elder, four faces for 4 seasons of a life. When the Nahua elders told Fray Bernardino de Sahagun about her, they called her goddess of carnal things, a Venus who devours the foulness people carry and leaves them newly washed. It is a terrifying mercy. She both inflames and absolves, both dirties and rinses. In some accounts she is Exquinan, she of 2 faces, patron of those publicly shamed. To stand before her is to say the thing aloud and let a god swallow it. When the penitent emerges, he perfumes his hands with copal smoke, ties on paper ornaments, and walks toward the courtyard's low fire. The rite is not just words. Words bend the heart, but blood seals the bend. Auto-sacrifice, the offering of one's own blood, threads everyday life, and the fasting calendar together like a thorn through skin. Ears, lips, tongue, shins, ordinary sights for ordinary days. But sex is a heavier door, and doors like that are locked with costlier keys. Some early sources, Nahua and Spanish alike, describe expiations where twigs or maggie spines pass through the tongue and the penis pain mapped to transgression, instrument to offense, so that the mouth that lied and the member that strayed both learn the grammar of straightness. Other testimonies tie genital blood to fertility itself, draw from the source of generation to ask for children. We can argue, and must, about friars' biases and the distortions of conquest, but the drumbeat of independent references suggests a practice not of the imagination but of the courtyard and the dawn. Watch how it happens, not as a cartoon of cruelty but as a choreography of intent. A priest places paper banners in the penitent's hands, soft amate that will drink what the body releases. The tools are small and dreadful in their ordinariness. Obsidian flakes, fishbone, the brown splinters of maguey. The man kneels, breath rising, and steadies the spine in his fingers. The first sting goes to the tongue, a flick, a swallow of iron taste. He speaks a prayer thickly over the paper as dots of red appear like seeds after rain. Then the lower body, not lewd but clinical, a task the way a farmer opens the furrow. He pricks, he waits, he pricks again. It is not punishment, it is a payment, and every pain teaches the heart its road. The paper will burn, the smoke will carry what was owed. If you want to see the logic, do not look away at this moment. This is the hinge on which a world turns. The Mexica did not hoard austerity for the lowly and pleasure for the high. Their kings bled themselves before they bled others, and their poets praised a tenderness shot through with terror flowers and song, love and fear, beauty that wilts unless it's fed. In the months of the ritual calendar, human bodies could become more than bodies. They called such a person an ixiptla, an embodiment, a living image that carried a god's mask for a season, and then returned the borrowed breath on a stone. The line between actor and deity blurred under garlands and paint. To the eyes of the crowd, the beloved figure walking the streets with grace, receiving gifts, perfumed and veiled, was not merely a man. He was a god come close enough to touch, and the city was obliged to treat him as such until the moment it was obliged to kill him. You can hear an argument forming in the back of your skull. Isn't all this just excuse and theatre for domination? Sometimes, yes, power rides every ritual like a hidden rider, but the right before you is as much discipline as display. Nahua moral texts collected in the colonial period insist again and again on restraint, how to court, how to marry, how not to spill what should be saved, how to keep the heart in the center between excess and starvation. When people failed, they did not merely apologize, they offered themselves as vessels of correction. The code is severe because the stakes are cosmic. The sun drinks, the fields thirst. The gods once tore themselves to kindle the world. You must at least open a vein to keep it turning. And if the phrase debt payment seems too neat, scholars warn us not to make a Spanish gloss into an Aztec catechism. The truth, as always, is less slogan and more tangle. Obligation, reciprocity, fear, love, beauty, and the terrible satisfaction of doing what hurts because it is right. Return to the courtyard. The paper curls, catches, and flares. Smoke rises like a column. The young man presses his brow to the flagstones, and for a moment the world shrinks to heat and heartbeat, to the soft crackle of burning bark and the broken throb of the drum. In the crack between shame and forgiveness, desire and discipline, he thinks he sees a woman's mouth open to devour something dark and slick. He thinks he hears her swallow. When he stands, his face looks emptied, not of self, but of residue. He ties on a clean mantle. The drums keep time. The city keeps breathing. If you came expecting only gore or only prudery, you will be disappointed. What the Mexica built was a perilous bridge between the two, and they crossed it, day after day, with incense and sweat, with vows and thorns, with a kindness as fierce as their knives. We will go further in the next part, into the palaces where flowers and songs trained bodies toward their final performance, into the months when gods borrowed flesh and the city fell in love with its own doom. But first, hold this opening in your hands, the scent of copal, a goddess who eats shame, a people who believed that desire, like maize, grows wild unless it is pruned, bled, and fed to the fire. Begin with a whisper, not a scream. The thrum of ankle bells in a long, low hall called the Cuicacali, the house of song. Oil lamps stain the reed mats with honeyed light. Boys and girls sit straight-backed, palms on thighs, while a drum answers their breath. Outside, the city quarrels with the lake wind. Inside, the teacher draws a world with sound. Flowers and songs, the Nahua say in Xochitl, in Cuicatl the twin path to truth when speech alone fails. Music is not decoration here. It is a training ground for the heart, a way to tune a body so that it can keep ritual time. On the calendar's edge days, when one feast is dying and the next is not yet born, the youths practice for 20 nights in the Cuicacali no dancing, only the strict sweetness of memory, as if the city is holding its breath before the next convulsion. Beneath this discipline, beneath the hard spine of piety, unfurls a goddess with a name like a garden. Xochiquetzal, flower, quetzal, feather, patron of weavers and young mothers, of delight and the arts. She is the varnish of beauty laid over the dangerous wood of desire. Colonial and modern lists make her Aphrodite's kin, but the Nahua knew her as more than a grin on a lover's mouth. She is the flash of a hummingbird at a blossom, the clever hand at the backstrap loom, the scent that breaks a fast. Where she walks, you expect joy. Where she lingers, you must expect a price. Around her shadow gather women whom the old texts name with a word that won't sit still, ahuyaname, joy givers. In the Florentine Codex's taxonomy of people, they are courtesans and entertainers, praised for wit and song, condemned for snares and lies, always described through the lens of moral panic. Some Spaniards, arriving with their own categories, called them sacred prostitutes, but that phrase is more smoke than torchlight. Modern scholars warn against stamping the Near Eastern fantasy of temple sex onto Mexico streets. What the sources do show is a world where performance, song, flirtation, costume was knitted to politics and ritual. The ahuyaname hover at the edges of palaces and festivals, a reminder that pleasure can be both public art and private danger. Picture one of them now in the Cuicacalai at dusk, hair perfumed, sleeves rippling like water. She does not sell her body in a sanctuary, she sells a mood, a sweetness on the tongue of the city by the hour. She teases a rhyme into a soldier's hand, spins gossip into a song, and slips out of reach before he can grasp the hook. The old men say she empties your purse, the young say she empties your loneliness. The truth is more complicated. She is the warm mask that lets the city rehearse its own tenderness before it needs to be cruel. This is not a brothel, it is a school. Here, youths learn the choreography of glances and gifts that will later bind festivals together. Here, the flower and the song are trained to bloom on command. And then there is the role no one asks for and many accept, becoming a god's image. Ixiptla is the word embodiment, impersonator, living effigy. The most famous is the youth who bears Tezcatlipoca's face through the month of Toxcatl. For a year he walks the streets as the city's beloved, flawless in limb, his breath sweet with flowers, his flute a silver thread through the market's roar. At the end, he marries 4 women who stand in for goddesses Xochiquetzal among them, salt and maize and water in the others' names, and for a few days the city allows itself the fiction that joy will not collapse into obligation. Then the day comes. He climbs the steps, he breaks the flute, a hand takes his elbow, and the promise in all that public tenderness is redeemed by a public knife. Not every Ixiptla lives a year. In other months and for other gods, an impersonator might be kept and honoured for 20 or 40 days. For Sheep Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, the chosen men are fattened and prepared in the wards before spring's brutal rebirth. The Mexican knew that time itself has textures, some long and lush, some fast and cutting, and they matched bodies to those textures like musicians choosing tempos. The pampering is not mercy, it is fuel laid neatly before the match. Where do the joy-givers stand in all this? The records are messy. Some insinuate they travelled with armies, that laughter and liquor were marched to the frontier alongside obsidian and drums. Others fold them into palace entertainments, the luminous garnish on statecraft. A few passages hint that captives tasted small courtesies, songs, embraces, cups of chocolate before they died, gestures that made the sacrifice feel less like a mugging and more like a gift ceremonially wrapped. But you should hold these claims with tongs. They are reported through translators' mouths and friars' pens. What we can say with confidence is that performance, the craft of bending emotion, was woven into ritual, and women trained in that craft stood where ritual needed them, between fear and consent, between the crowd's hunger and the victim's trembling. Return to the house of song. A teacher ancient as rope demonstrates a new cadence, and 100 palms slap thighs in perfect answer. The Cuicacalai serves many masters. It is rehearsal hall, tribunal, finishing school, sometimes even a space for public trials and penance, because a community's shame must be tuned as carefully as its hymns. Here, youths learn to keep their bodies immobile, while their voices do the labor. Elsewhere, they will learn to keep their faces smiling while their city does the killing. The lesson is the same. Hold the line, don't break the beat. In this aesthetic of discipline, sex is not chaos, it is meter. Young nobles have their pleasures hemmed by rules. Do not drink before the rite, do not touch before the sign, do not spend a winter's seed in a summer's hour. Straighten the heart, the elders say, and the youths, aching with pride and hunger, nod. The Ahumaname make that hunger articulate. Xochiquetzal makes the articulation beautiful. The calendar makes it useful. And auto-sacrifice, those little doors cut into flesh, makes it binding. When the paper catches and the smoke rises, the city believes again that bodies can be tuned like instruments until they play the song the gods require. If you need proof that beauty and horror are neighbors here, listen to Toxcatl's epilogue. After the year-long performance, after the wedding garlands and the palms pressed to passing lips, the Ixiptla climbs the temple and snaps his flute, snaps the city's enchantment with it. This gesture, small and rude, is the hinge on which joy turns to debt. The metaphor could not be clearer. Music is over, blood must speak. And yet people weep when he disappears behind the screen of priests. Not just because a man is about to die, but because a way of being has run out of time. In the Mexica imagination, the most terrible things are also the most exquisitely staged. The audience is never allowed to forget that what they love, their flowers, their songs, their youth, is exactly what the universe will require as payment. We will walk next into the months when skin is currency and rebirth is signed in scarlet or Spanistli's sweeping, and Tlacaxipihualistli's flaying rituals that force men to wear women's roles and priests to wear human hides, where the city performs its strangest marriages. Earth to body, God to mask, desire to discipline. But keep this chamber in your pocket as we go, the Cuicacali's throb, the smile that is both invitation and warning, a flute, thread of sweetness winding straight toward a stone. The month of sweeping begins before dawn. Brooms whisper along the causeways. Door lintels are rinsed with lake water. Hearths go cold. In the precinct, women of the midwives and healers' guilds move like a tide through the streets, staging mock skirmishes with balls of flowers and reeds, ritual laughter shaken loose before the city asks for tears. At the center of this choreography is a single body, a young woman chosen as Tochi's living image. She is bathed, perfumed, watched, her keepers joke to make her smile because a goddess does not weep. When night falls, they lead her up the steps. There is no pretense now, only the blade, the binding, the terrible quiet of a crowd consenting to necessity. What happens next is the hinge on which the Mexica imagination turns. The skin is taken, and a very strong priest, naked and shivering, struggles into the wet garment. The city has made a new Toshi from a woman's skin and a man's breath. Gender bends with the hide, meaning slides under the flesh. In the darkness, our grandmother rises to sweep the way for war. If you look only for gore, you will miss the point. Ochpanistli is housework writ cosmic. The city is reset, fires doused, floors scrubbed, disorder gathered, and cast aside so that fields may be reset too. The flayed skin of Tochi's Ixiptla is not just horror, it is material theology. Like a husk stripped from a seed, it promises that what is shed can feed what is to come. The priest who wears it, a woman for a circuit of streets, carries a paradox in public. Healing mother and eater of men, midwife and war's patron, the one who devours our filth and the one who demands our blood. The festival's comic jostling and gender inversions are not a sideshow but a spell ritual cheerfulness before a harvest of bodies. From sweeping to flaying without a seam, the calendar steps into Tlacaxipihualistli. The flaying of men, the month of Xiptotec, our Lord the Flayed One. Here the theology is worn on the outside. Warriors bring captives to the precinct, and hearts are taken on the stone. Then knives work with a craftsman's patience to free a single suit of skin. Priests put it on like spring itself, yellowed with ochre, called Tenochtitlan, the golden garments, because the new flesh of fields is gold when the rains are faithful. For 20 days, the city lives with the dead close to the skin. Men in other men's faces walk the neighborhoods, beg alms in the god's name, bless infants with the touch of a cured hide, and dance until the seams begin to open and the smell says the time of wearing is done. The hides are then folded away in lidded containers at Yupico, a temple space within the great precinct, a practical mercy, and a final reverence. The killings of Tlacaxipihualistli are not interchangeable. Some victims die in a gladiatorial rite, tied by a white cord to the round stone, given a mock macuahuatl with feathers for blades, made to face ranked champions. Others are bound to a wooden frame and shot with a cloud of arrows so that their blood patters onto the earth like rain. Afterwards, their hearts are opened out, their skins lifted free. Each method has its grammar, courage rehearsed in defeat, blood falling as a petition for the fields. And over all these acts sits an agricultural metaphor so stark it can be read with your eyes closed. A god who shed his own covering, so maize might shed its husk and germinate. A city that must put on new skin when the year turns. If this looks like obscenity masquerading as piety, look again at the politics. Every robe of skin is also a proclamation. We took this man in war, we dressed the god in his conquered body. Sheep's month is a census of power done in flesh, and the precinct remembers the count. The skull towers rising by Templo Mayor are not rumor, but masonry, the Hui Tzompantli built from the front-facing discs of hundreds of heads, men and women and children mortared into a single white argument for empire. When archaeologists cleared a new section of that tower, they found more than a century's debate about Mexica violence embedded in a wall, not numbers in a chronicle, but foreheads and jaws laid carefully in circles. The priests bless, the captains boast, and the stone insists, without ornament, that sovereignty here was written in bone. A further sting. What becomes of the flesh once the god has been fed? Sources do not agree, and the arguments matter, yet several strands of testimony say portions of certain victims were cooked and eaten in ritual meals by those with the right to claim them, some merchant offerings, some war captive feasts. a piece served in a maize stew and shared among a defined circle, an intimacy of obligation rather than a market of meat. Others deny any regular cannibal custom, insisting the Mexica diet was rich enough that no stomach needed such supplement, that when eating happened, its logic was ceremonial, not nutritional. Archaeology can show cut marks, it cannot weigh ore and taboo. What is clear is that body parts could circulate as sanctified goods, bones drilled for racks, skins worn for 20 days, skulls mortared into towers, proof that a person might become a liturgy's furniture when the state made him so. But where, you ask, is sex in all this? It is not pornography, it is grammar. In Ochpanisli, the priests knew womanhood is the city's joke and terror, a camp of skin in which to stage the union of earth and war. In Tlacaxipihualisli, the golden hide clings to a dancer's groin, and the god who taught men to molt walks the streets in someone else's thighs. The month lies open with innuendo because agriculture itself is indecent plough and furrow, seed and blood water. Even the arrow rite is an erotic pun anyone raised in fields can read. The body splayed, the shaft's bright flight, the red rain blessing the ground. In such spectacles, sexuality is not private heat but public instrument, a set of signs the city uses to rehearse growth, death, and the exchange rate between the two. And still, under the drums, politics keeps whispering. A captive made beautiful before death washed, anointed. Married to goddesses for a day is not being consoled, he is being made legible to a crowd whose consent the state needs. The prettiness is part of the prosecution. If the audience falls in love with a body shaped like divinity, then the sacrifice that follows carries more wind in its sails. Sovereignty here is a theatre. The ruler's face at the shrine door, the captain's procession, the priests in borrowed skins, the goldsmith's rattling sheep's staff in Yopiko, the housewives putting out bowls for the flayed ones who come to bless their infants and beg for pulque. A city watches itself perform the cosmic story in which it is cast and pays for its ticket in captives. You could call it horror, and you would be right. But to the Mexica, the horror is a virtue kept in its proper pen, a violence spent so rains will come and maize will rise and the sun, which once stalled in darkness, will consent to climb. Sex is not a side plot to that economy. It is the metaphor that makes it legible. Seed and husk, skin and fruit, marriage and harvest. The flayed priest's swaying walk, the arrow's bite, the damp embrace of another's hide, these are not kinks, they are mnemonics. And when the paper offerings catch and the smoke lifts, the city believes once more that the world can be fed with what it fears most. Next, we will step behind the stage curtain into the law. Vows, punishments, and the sharp little doors in the body that open when desire strays. The bridge between pleasure and penalty is narrower than you think. Begin with the whisper of legal breath, a judge's reed pen tapping the edge of a folded mat, a scribe's lips shaping Nahuatl terms that feel half moral, half meteorological, crooked, slippery, out of balance. The Mexica did not imagine desire as a private pastime, but as weather that could ruin a harvest if it turned. So they built levees, vows, fasts, public shame, and pains small and large. The elders' speeches, the Huhetlatole, do not mince words. They tell youths to keep the middle path, to keep their bodies clean and their hands steady, to save laughter and pulque for the days appointed, to know that sex done out of season hobbles the household and insults the gods. In those discourses you hear not prudery, but project management for a living cosmos. Marriage is where that weather is harnessed. Night falls. The bride is carried to the groom's house by a torchlit procession. At the threshold, matchmakers tie what must be tied. His cloak and her skirt are knotted together, the literal binding that later tongues would call tying the knot. There will be gifts for elders and incense for shrines, but not yet a bed as we imagine it. For 4 days the pair fast, speak softly, and live under watch. The mat on which they sit is raised ceremonially after the 4th dawn. Only then may the new household loosen its belt and breathe. The restraint is not an anti-sex sermon, it is a calibration, the way farmers hold seed until the first good rain. Law stands behind this choreography like a stone wall. Adultery, especially when it touches a noble house or threatens inheritances, is treated as a civic derailment. Punishments vary with rank, circumstance, and the proofs at hand, but colonial-era descriptions of pre-conquest practice repeatedly mention public execution by stoning or strangulation, particularly for elites who were supposed to embody discipline. Lesser penalties, fines, banishment, public shaming appear for commoners in some cases, and Spanish-era church courts later replace many of these with pews and penances. The texture is uneven. filtered through friar pens and city-state differences, yet the outline is hard to miss. Sexual disorder was a public offense because its damage was public. The 4-day hush after a wedding is mirrored all across the ritual year. Fasts are not only about food, they turn down every appetite until the skin hears clearer. Priests and impersonators refrain from sex as they approach the precinct's days of spectacle. Hunters and celebrants narrow their lives before festivals. A scholar of Nahua fasting calls it a series of don'ts: seclusion, grime on the face, plain garments, sparse meals, and no coupling, each subtraction sharpening the city's attention until the drum can be heard through bone. To make a body into an instrument, you must mute what buzzes. And when lines are crossed? The Mexica do not imagine apology as a speech alone. The penances the elders set are tactile: washing in the sweat house, sleeping on reeds, and the small cut that makes an idea real. Auto-sacrifice is the language of correction. Blood is a signature. Sources from both Nahua and Spanish hands describe expiations in which maguey thorns pass through lips, ears, tongues sometimes, crucially, through the penis, so that the member that wandered, or the mouth that lied, learns the grammar of straightness. This is not theatre for outsiders. It is physics. Pain refastens meaning to the hand that offered it. Severity falls hardest where example must be loud. A lord who drinks at the wrong time, who boasts too wetly, who makes himself ridiculous with stolen embraces, can expect little mercy. The law is a mirror held higher for him than for others, not because nobles are less human, but because their bodies stand in for the city's body. Your hunger is not only yours, the old speeches imply. It is a whether the rest of us must live beneath. That logic bleeds into the precinct, where ixipta living images of gods are kept chaste until their appointed hour, their pleasures embargoed until the calendar itself releases them and, with a final turn, consumes them. The marriage mat rises on the 4th day for a reason deeper than superstition. Nahua time has contours. Beginnings must be edged with quiet or they fray. So the city slows the pair, tempers them, and only then lets them fall into each other's arms, ideally on an auspicious count, with the hearth relit and the house gods fed. The effect is aesthetic as well as ethical. Desire, disciplined, becomes music rather than noise. The old women who keep watch at the door are not chaperones in the European sense. They are stagehands, making sure the first act lands. Do not confuse the leash with loathing. The Mexica are not enemies of touch. Their poems bloom with kisses and perfumes, their festivals with flirtations and jokes, but they are allergic to waste. Spilled seed, like spilled blood, has consequences, and the law imagines those consequences in concentric rings: household, calpuli, market, field. If sowing is sacred, sowing in the wrong field is sacrilege. That is why adultery trials draw crowds and witnesses, why a matron's cloak and a lover's footprints can be exhibits, why punishments are designed not merely to hurt but to demonstrate that equilibrium is being restored. And the shame that cannot be unbraided from desire? There is a goddess for that. Tlazolteotl, the eater of filth, sits astride this whole arrangement, terrifying and tender. When confession is made to her, when the temazcal stones are red, and the penitent's hair drips and the copal thickens, abstinence becomes a hinge rather than a cage. Out of that heat, people walk straighter. Law without right is only fear. Right without law is only smoke. Together they make a road. We have walked the knife edge now. Vows like reins. Feasts with breaks. Punishments that write their verdicts on skin. And the little doors cut into the body when words are not enough. The bridge between pleasure and penalty is real, narrow, and busy. On the far side, where the law breathes out, the calendar breathes in. In the next part, we will watch the inhale of a new religion and a new empire, the friar's confessional colliding with the Nahua, straightening of the heart, the sweat house repurposed, the goddess of filth translated and mistranslated. What happens when two very different systems of managing desire try to use the same human body as their stage? The first confession is whispered in a language the friar barely understands. He sits in a cedar booth hacked together in a new church on old stones, the wreck of Tenochtitlan still damp in the foundations, and listens as a Nahua elder tells him, haltingly, that his heart slid, that desire made mud of his footsteps, that he has come to be set straight. The friar hears sin. The penitent, in his own words, offers crookedness. Between them stretches a bridge of metaphors: filth and washing, slipping and balance, hunger and abstinence. Later, scholars will call this contact zone a moral dialogue, a place where two systems recognize each other just enough to clash efficiently. But at this moment the air is thick with copal ghosts, and the elder expects what his mother taught him to expect, that the goddess who eats filth will devour what clings to him and leave him clean. The friar says an Ave and prescribes prayers. The elder bows, relieved and bewildered. Two confessions have touched without fully meeting. Nahua's moral speech had always leaned on the earth. It is slippery, the elders said. Keep to the middle. After the conquest, that speech did not vanish, it was redirected. Christian catechists translated their own vocabulary into Nahuatl, and Nahua teachers mapped Tlazoli filth, moral and physical, onto the new word, pecado, sin. Our sources are, yes, colonial, filtered through scribes, schoolmasters, friars, but they strand the same image again and again. Desire as dirt that clings, the self as a path that needs sweeping, the heart as a thing that can be set straight. Louise Burkhart's patient reading of sermons and confessional manuals shows how missionaries leaned into these indigenous images. Even as they condemned the rites that once enacted them, they kept the metaphors, they burned the scripts. What then became of the old technologies of cleanness, the sweat house, the thorn, the burning paper? The temescal did not die, it was disciplined. The friars often associated it with licentiousness and naked mischief, and tried, at times, to curtail its use. Still, the sweat house endured as a place of cure and childbirth, warmed by stones and herbs, defended by habit stronger than edict. Sahagun himself, who disapproved of much and recorded everything, noted its medicinal power in the voices of Nahua physicians. Colonial authorities might cluck at nefarious pleasures, but steam kept rising, and with it a theology of heat that could be translated into new terms, cleanliness of the body now serving decency of the soul. Auto-sacrifice, the small doors cut into the body, fared worse. Friars cast thorns as diabolical pins and obsidian as instruments of superstition. Public bloodletting unravelled alongside the calendar that timed it. Yet elements lived on as discreet gestures within Christian practice. Fasts with stricter edges, nights spent on reed mats in penitential vigils, offerings shifted from paper flags to woven scapulars. Incense censers swung before new saints, as once before old gods. In the sermons, Nahua words stay stubborn. Straightening the heart remains a recommended outcome. The friars accept the goal uprightness, while forbidding the old means. In this way reform looks, to Nahua eyes, like a recaptioning rather than a replacement. The gods were not simply beheaded, they were translated into opponents, shadows, doubles. Tlazolteotl, once a terrifying mercy who ate what soiled you, is recast as the demon behind lust and shame, a figure to be spat upon rather than consulted. But language remembers. In Nahuatl Christian sermons, filth still requires cleansing, slipping is still confessed, straightness is still prayed for. The goddess's broom becomes the friar's rosary. The Tamascal's heat becomes the heat of contrition. Meanwhile, Book X of the Florentine Codex, an encyclopedia of people and their virtues and vices as remembered in the first post-conquest generation, preserves a portrait of the old moral landscape in the very act of its retranslation. You can almost hear the negotiation on the page. What of the theatre of death, the months of flaying, the year of Tezcatlipoca's beloved youth? Those stages were dismantled, their props smashed or carried into museums centuries later, but the scripts survive in ink. Book 2 of the Florentine Codex still marks the Tenochtitlan appointment. A new Ixiptla, chosen as the old one dies, stewarded through a year of tenderness to the last flute snap. Duran retells festivals with a friar's fury and a journalist's appetite for detail, giving us in the very texts meant to erase a record of what was. The result is a double archive, Nahuatl voices narrating their own ritual logic, and Spanish voices arguing with them, sometimes violently, on the page. It is messy, biased, indispensable. The edges of syncretism are not soft, they are stitched and scarred. Lockhart's social history follows Nahua towns as they learn to sign Spanish names while keeping Nahua property logics, to pray from Christian books while making offerings at the house hearth, to stand in pews on Sunday and in milpas on Monday, invoking saints whose calendars accidentally echoed older ones. In matters of sex and punishment, too, accommodations formed. Church courts displaced pre-conquest penalties with penances, confessions, and marriages regularized under Tridentine rules. Yet local councils and elders continued to police desire with shaming songs, public admonitions, and house-to-house watchfulness. The old weather metaphors, "Your hunger is a storm the rest of us must live beneath," remained persuasive even as the instruments of forecast changed. It would be soothing to say that the horrific sexual rites were simply buried with the idols and that what remained was gentler. But empires do not erase appetite, they reorganize it. The Mexica once spent terror in a single, gold-limbed month by walking a flayed god through their streets. The Habsburg order tried to spend terror in confessionals, whipping posts, and royal decrees. The Nahua imagination, which had always known how to sweep a city clean before planting, learned to sweep a conscience. The friars, who had never seen a sweathouse rebirth, learned to hear a Nahua talk about heat. On both sides of the booth, people adjusted their metaphors a little and kept going. If you want a single image to carry out of the ruins, take this. The great temple flattened, and on its footprint the new cathedral rising, its choir loft catching a draught that smells faintly, absurdly, of copal from a household altar a street away. In the sacristy, a carved virgin floats on a crescent moon, her robe starred as any goddess of night. A mother whispers at her feet about a daughter who runs with the wrong boys, about a husband who drinks the wrong nights, and asks not for a thunderbolt, not for a knife that someone straighten her family's hearts. The priest gives a formula and a blessing. Outside, market women sweep their stalls with the brisk competence of Orpanistli, because sweeping is the kind of ritual every empire allows. What we have walked through is not a museum of exotic cruelties, but a system, a logic in which sex is metaphor and lever, in which bodies are instruments tuned for cosmic maintenance, in which horror is not random but calendrical. The conquest shattered the calendar and mothballed the instruments. It did not delete the need to tune. That is why the old words survive in new mouths, why a temescal's steam still curls behind the measured smoke of incense, why passions still threaten to flood households unless levied by custom. The question this history asks of us is impolite. What do we sacrifice now, and where do we hide the altar? We do not flay men in spring, no, but we spend other bodies in other months, and we narrate those losses as necessary to harvests of a different kind. If the Mexica made horror legible by staging it, we make ours invisible by distributing it. Which is worse? That is not a question the Florentine Codex can answer. It is ours. We are left, then, with a human constant and a cultural variation. Desire needs grammar. Communities need rituals to hold back their own weather. The Mexica built theirs out of flowers and knives. The empire that replaced them built out of pews and ledgers. In the cracks between, Nahua people kept living, sweeping, planting, loving, abstaining, confessing in a voice that learned new prayers without forgetting how the world had once been fed.